We tend to think that scribes are literate. Sometimes writers couldn't read. And the reason for this is because in order to be a good scribe, you have to be good at one particular thing, and that is recognizing letters and being able to write the letters that you recognize. I mean, we don't have the statistics on this. We do know of a rather famous example of an Egyptian scribe named Ptahus, who was clearly illiterate. Scribes are copying letters, they're copying texts. Even if they can read a little bit, we're dealing with a scribal error at some point in the chain of transmission. The best estimates right now are that anywhere from 2 to 4% of the male population of Palestine at around the time of Jesus was literate.
Welcome to Gnostic Informant. Today I got a special guest, Dr. Kip Davis, a trailblazer when it comes to the Dead Sea Scrolls. Dr. Kip Davis, tell us about your education.
Trailblazer.
Oh yeah, I'm saying it. I know you're a humble guy, but I'm saying it anyway.
Okay, so I started in Bible college with intentions of going into pastoral ministry, and then switched track after a few years when I discovered that I didn't like people very much, and they frown on that. If if you want to be a pastor, you kind of have to tolerate people. So I was no good at that.
You were a Christian.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And honestly, I'm still kind of like, I'm not a practicing Christian anymore, but I'm really kind of waffling in terms of what I believe. I'm fairly non-committal about where I stand on this.
Sure.
So, I'm a cultural Christian at this point. So I transferred into university, which was a Christian university, and I was fortunate enough to be at the right place at the right time. I was at Trinity Western University out here on the West Coast, right when Professors Peter Flint and Martin Abegg arrived and launched the Dead Sea Scrolls Institute. And so for the remainder of my undergrad, and I did a graduate degree at Trinity for the next 4 or 5 years or however long it was, my education was just a total immersion in Dead Sea Scrolls. And then I graduated from there in 2002, and I went on to do a PhD in the School of Religions and Theology at the University of Manchester, in Manchester, England, studying under the eminent Scrolls and New Testament scholar George J. Brooke, who's now retired, but a terrific guy. Well, no, I'm sure lots of retired people are terrific guys, right? Once you retire, you don't stop being a terrific guy. So that sounded dumb. Sorry.
No, it's true. But
yes. So I was there until 2009, when I graduated, and I had postdoc stops here on the coast. I spent 3 years working in Norway at the University of Actor for the Biblical Text Older Than the Bible project.
Wow.
So I've been around. Yeah.
You know Greek. Yeah. You know Greek and Hebrew pretty well.
Pretty well. My Greek's okay. Hebrew's my strongest. Aramaic's fine, but
which is where mostly the Dead Sea Scrolls is.
Yeah, I'm not like I never had a really strong interest in the A&E stuff, so I never did do Ugaritic or Sumerian.
Ooh,
I have
tough. That's tough.
Yeah, it is. I have a textbook. I've kind of thought I might try and
just like a bunch of little like notches on clay. It's like, how do you even?
Oh, I know. It's
totally different system.
It's ridiculous. Well, honestly, it's I always thought something like this is just completely illegible. I don't understand how anybody could read it. But now I've had a little bit of experience, and I'll probably get some more in the future working with like Hebrew and Aramaic ostraka, which are you familiar with ostraka?
Not really.
So these are potsherds, essentially, broken pieces of pottery with writing on them.
Okay, I got you.
Because pottery was extremely plentiful throughout the Second Temple period. I don't know how far back, but certainly, um, you know, from at least the third or fourth century BC all the way through the time of Jesus, within Palestine, and I think in Jewish communities, at least in Egypt too, in the area, documentary texts, lists, inventories, deeds, letters were written on potsherds.
Right.
And they're all written in cursive Hebrew.
Wow.
And because I have a very strong interest in scribalism and scribal practices, that's really where I think I do my best work. One of the things that I find really fascinating, and something that gets overlooked a lot by readers and by people who study the Bible, is that people, just because you could write didn't necessarily mean that you could read literature. Okay, you could read words, you could read your name, you could recognize certain terms, but actually being able to string them together or see them within a sentence and read the whole sentence. And because we're such a hyper literate society, it's so difficult to even imagine how this works. But this is how it was in the ancient world. Just because you could write letters didn't guarantee that you were any good at reading them.
Well, to add to what you're saying right now, when I started really digging into like ancient history in the Bible and Hebrew a little bit, I started using the Rosetta Stone app because I wanted to just get the basics of Hebrew down. Yep. So I can say stuff like Hayelid Shotei Ma'im, the boy drinks water.
Yeah.
But as soon as I hear someone else talking in Hebrew to someone else, I have no idea what they're saying. I can't even keep up at all. It's like it's a totally different ball game when you go to fluent.
It really is.
Yeah.
And even for me, someone who never actually all the languages I learned, and I think you'll discover this is the case for a lot of biblical scholars, the languages that we learn are the written languages that reside entirely in the text. I have Israeli friends. I've been to Israel. I have lots of Jewish friends who speak Hebrew, and I'll be able to kind of follow along a little bit. I'll catch bits and pieces, but I go in and out just because my brain is not processing it nearly as fast as I can when it's written down, and you can. So yeah, all that to say, the potsherds are inscribed with a cursive form of the language, which can be very difficult to read, and
extremely hard to read.
Oh yeah,
and it looks like a different language.
It really does.
It does.
It really, really does. And the people who are doing the writing, I mean, it's hard. I think it's got to be hard to write on pottery in the first place. Yeah. And it's more like a paintbrush than it is actually like a stylus. And it's sloppy. It's a big sloppy mess. So all that to say, I don't feel quite so bad about not being able to read the cuneiform, because that cursive Hebrew and Aramaic documentary stuff, it's
go to Dr. Josh for that kind of stuff.
Exactly.
He's the man.
Go to Dr. Josh.
Yeah. So I got a question for you.
Yes, sir.
Oftentimes you hear from apologists that the text that they have today, in particular, even the King James Bible, which seems to be the most popular English Bible, that everything that's in there is exactly what was written down by, in particular, the Old Testament and the New. Everything that was in there is written down perfectly, translated perfectly, pure and perfect text from what is in the ancient Hebrew and the ancient Greek. What is their response to that?
So it's a complicated answer to a difficult proposition or a difficult question. Because on the one hand, that's that's partially true within reason, right? Like, and
Sure.
within
Yeah.
this person, like it's this is where the difficulty comes in.
Okay.
Um, you'll often hear that one of the favorite tropes of Christian apologists with regards to the Old Testament in particular is that it's been completely validated or verified by the discoveries of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and that's true to an extent. I mean, it's true that prior to the discovery of the scrolls, the oldest Hebrew text that we had of the Old Testament dated to like the medieval period. The Leningrad Codex comes from the 10th century. The Aleppo Codex is a little bit older than that. There's a small fragment called the Nash Papyrus, which preserves part of the it preserves the Decalogue as well as in both Exodus and parts of the same text in Deuteronomy. It's a pretty fascinating text, but this dated back to probably the mid second century BCE, prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the oldest Hebrew text of the Bible that we had, but it was just this one little bit of text, right?
Right.
So in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the scrolls that were discovered at Qumran, there's like numbers range between about 900 and 1,000 manuscripts, and of those, probably the last time I counted, it's like 220, about 220 to 230 are so-called biblical manuscripts. That is fragments of text that are in the Hebrew Bible.
Right.
And so what we did discover in the Dead Sea Scrolls is that a lot of these fragments, lots of these texts, are very close, in nearly identical to the text that's preserved in Biblia Hebraica, the so-called Masoretic text, which is like the standard Hebrew text that our English Bibles are based on.
Right.
What the apologists aren't telling you is that in addition to these copies that look very close to the Masoretic text, you also have copies written in Hebrew that look like alternative versions of biblical books preserved in the Septuagint. There's Septuagint copies of Jeremiah in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is wildly different than the Masoretic version. There's Septuagint Samuel. There's Septuagint Exodus.
For people who don't know, what you're saying right now, the Septuagint is the Greek Torah, right? Or is it the
Greek translation
of the Hebrew Torah? And it was written after the time of Alexander the Great in the 200s BC. But it was also updated a lot from then till like the Middle Ages. So the whatever version was out in the 200s BC is no longer you can no longer find that.
Probably something like that. Yeah.
Okay.
So and I'm not really, I don't know a lot about the textual criticism of the Septuagint. I have a friend who is a Septuagint text critic, and I asked him the question once what the manuscript situation was like, what the strength of the manuscript tradition is, and he told me, he says it's pretty bad. He said, there's
I hear that everywhere.
So there's like, there's Codex Sinaiticus, and I think Vaticanus is Greek, right?
According to Rabbi Tobias Singer, the Septuagint, he says, quote, rapes the text. That's what his quote is.
Well,
he thinks that a lot of it was moved because, so for example, this is another topic we're going to get into. There's a lot of ways you can translate Hebrew into Greek and make it and mold it, make it malleable to what you want. So if you wanted to, if you're it's for a Christian audience, there's ways to twist it a little bit to Christianize it, and I'm sure you know some examples of that.
That's true. That's true. So that is true. I would say though, I don't think I'd go as far as to say it rapes the text, because we have Hebrew copies of texts that align with the Septuagint,
Right.
that come from before the time of Jesus, that
Sure.
were preserved, within Jewish communities. So, all this to say, in addition to manuscripts that align with the Hebrew Bible texts that our English translations are based on, we also have these alternative versions. There are copies of text that look like the Samaritan Pentateuch, which is the version of the text that was still read by the Samaritan Jewish community, the very, very tiny
Wow.
surviving Samaritan Jewish community. And it's a different text again. And then you've got other things that we don't even know how to classify. Scholars have invented categories for texts that we don't quite know how to identify within biblical literature. One of these is called reworked Pentateuch. There's a series of Pentateuch manuscripts in the Dead Sea Scrolls that are, again, wildly different from the Masoretic text, look a little bit like the Samaritan Pentateuch, but not really. And the editor at the time, Emmanuel Tove, an amazing, brilliant, quite famous Dead Sea Scrolls scholar, was editing these texts. And I was told by my supervisor, George Brooke, that he was in an elevator with Professor Tove once at the University of Pennsylvania, and Tove was telling him about his frustration with these texts as he's trying to edit them, because he doesn't, they're not quite anything. They're not like anything that we have from the Bible, but they're not so different that they look like the Midrashim, which were these early Jewish elaborations, I guess, on biblical stories, right? So he's like, I don't know what to do with these. I don't know what to call these. And according to George Brooke, he suggested the name Reworked Pentateuch. And Emmanuel Tove really liked that. So that's what they got identified as. More recently, Professor Tove has come around to saying that he thinks they should be reclassified as they've been called 4Q Reworked Pentateuch, in keeping with how he published them. But he's come around to say that he thinks they should be redesignated as 4Q Pentateuch, because they're just, it is an arbitrary separation that we have sort of set on where are we going to put this dividing line between what's Bible and what's not, in a period when there was no such thing. Right. Like the Jews at the time of Jesus in the Second Temple period clearly had an idea of authoritative texts. They cited from things that they identified as scripture. They talked about scripture, but the edges on this collection and what's inside the collection are really fuzzy. There doesn't seem to be much concern at all among anyone about textual traditions and variety.
So it's not like a canon, right? It's not like a canon.
No, not at all.
Scrolls, just six, scroll here, scroll there, scroll here. If they're not all put together.
Yeah.
Right? Okay.
Exactly.
And and then you got stuff like the War Scrolls. What exactly is that?
So the War Scroll is a fairly large, impressive document. It's what's left is there's about, I think it's 17 or 18 columns of text that have survived. It is we would call it an apocalyptic text only because it exhibits this apocalyptic worldview, and it seems to be telling the story or predicting what's going to happen in the future battle in the last days between the sons of light and the sons of darkness, between the forces of God and the wicked forces of Belial, who is like a Satan figure, right? He's the evil dark one. And I say it's a difficult text to classify because we have lots of what we call apocalypses. The book of Revelation is, within the literary genre of an apocalypse. It's a retelling of history, but from the perspective of a more distant past and looking forward into the future.
Right.
It contains all these symbols. There's a fixation on things like numbers. There's angels and demons. These are all sort of features that exist within what we call apocalypses.
Right.
And the problem with the War Scroll is it doesn't really fit. Like, it's the way it reads, it sort of goes, here's what's going to happen in the war of the last days between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. And the first part of it is actually really boring stuff, where it just kind of goes through troop, like the organization of the troops, and who's going to fight where and which men can fight, because not all of them are going to be physically fit enough. There's a deep concern for purity, because the people involved in this battle, the men who are involved in this battle, are going to be fighting alongside the angels of God, so they have to be ritually pure.
That's fascinating.
Even just it's amazing.
Like they're more focused on that than winning the actual war.
Well, yeah, because they don't have to do anything. God's just gonna, it goes like the basic structure of it sort of narrates and says, so the first battle happens and the forces of Belial win, and the second battle happens and the forces of God under the leadership of the Archangel Michael win, and they kind of go back and forth.
Right.
And it's a tie after 6 battles, and then in the final battle, God comes down and just right? He just blows everybody. We don't have the complete text. Like, it breaks off at the end, so we don't quite know exactly how it ends, but we know this much. So, and of course, they weren't worried about it, because God's going to win, right? In the end, God is going to win. I'm happy you brought up the War Scroll, though, because it's a super, super interesting text for other reasons too.
Yes.
I've done a little bit of work on so we know the War Scroll from this document that came out of cave 1. There's 11 caves in around the Qumran area. Yeah, it's good, eh? So I'm not a 6-fingered man, otherwise I'd have this covered. So we got a copy of the War Scroll that came out of cave 1. And it's relatively complete. But then in cave 4, which is really where the mother lode was, there was some 500 fragments from some 500 manuscripts came out of just cave 4.
Wow.
And within cave 4, there are fragments from copies of the War Scroll, but not complete. One of these, it has the catalog designation 4Q491, is a really, really interesting text, because it reads like parts of the War Scroll, and you can see places where it directly overlaps, but then it will break into some pretty interesting differences. And my interpretation of this manuscript is that it's like a really early version of the War Scroll. It was like a pre-War Scroll where they hadn't had the whole structure developed.
Wow.
And it included some other stuff. Like, within this, it's got within this one document, it's got the what's called the courses for war, the descriptive stuff sort of at the beginning. We see that in some of the fragments, and then a gap. And then following that is it's like, it depends on how you divide it, but it's either 2 or 3 hymns. And these hymns actually correspond with another text altogether called the Chodayot, which is a collection of Thanksgiving psalms. So, but they're all together in this one manuscript. And then after that, there's another section which describes one of the battles. And this was really interesting because within the War Scroll from Cave 1, the Archangel Michael plays a pivotal role in the fighting. And from this Cave 4 copy, we have one of these passages that feature Michael, yet he's not there at all. So what we have within these manuscripts is like actual textual development that we can see and track from this manuscript, which looks like it was like a collection of a bunch of these earlier ideas and traditions, to something like the War Scroll, which was only at best 100 years younger. So like within a 100-year period, you can see textual development and the kind of textual development that scholars have been predicting that takes place within the Hebrew Bible texts themselves. Now, and the War Scroll is a really neat example, but there's all sorts of other texts within the Dead Sea Scrolls where you can see this exact same thing. You can see it in copies of the so-called Serach HaYachad. You can see it in copies of the so-called Damascus document. You can see it in a text that I did my PhD dissertation on called the Apocryphon of Jeremiah. There is ongoing textual development and change and adaptation that you can track.
It almost seems like it almost seems like they're borrowing a mythos from Daniel, which would also makes you wonder because there's two theories about Daniel being later or Daniel being earlier. If Daniel is later, like some people say, that would make sense that it would be around the time when the War Scrolls are being written, somewhere in between the Hellenized period.
So, yeah, Daniel's another story altogether, because we have something that apologists like to talk about when it comes to the Book of Daniel is how there are copies of the Book of Daniel in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and there's at least one of them that's quite early. Like you can date it to the late 2nd century, early 1st century BCE. So if Daniel was written, or at least the final, the last, what is it, 6 chapters? The last 6 chapters of Daniel were clearly written in the 2nd century.
Right, it's post Alexander,
Yeah. So you've got fragments that date within 50, 60, 70 years of when this was written, and the argument from apologists is this is impossible, because nobody would have regarded this as scripture, which the collectors of the Dead Sea Scrolls supposedly did, because they identify Daniel as a prophet. They quote from the Book of Daniel, but it's a bit of a flimsy argument, because the people who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls also quote from the Book of Jubilees,
right,
which was also written in the 2nd century.
Yeah.
They loved the hell out of the Book of Enoch.
I was just going to say Enoch too, yeah.
Which is a little earlier.
And another thing about Enoch, I'm surprised it didn't make the canon of the Christian Bible, because Paul uses it, or whoever wrote it. Paul uses Enoch a lot in the epistles.
It appears in Jude for sure.
Yeah.
I don't know about. I guess
maybe not a lot, but
you could probably make connections to Paul with Enoch. I'm not entirely sure how strong those are, but the Ethiopic Church has
they have that in the
Bible. It's still there.
Yeah,
it's still in their canon.
Yes.
Along with all sorts of other interesting things like Psalm 153 and 154.
Yeah, they have a lot of extra stuff. Yeah.
Oh yeah. So it's canon development, authority, scripture. This is all really, really fascinating stuff, and the Dead Sea Scrolls tell us a lot about what's going on there.
And it plays into what we were talking about of people interpreting the text how they want it to be over time. And which brings me to the next thing is like, okay, so you got a Dead Sea Scroll fragment that's so unreadable. It's but just looks like a blur. It looks like a bunch of ink got smeared on a piece of papyrus. And then you got people who are, their job is, they're scholars, and they're trying to decipher what it says. Now my question is, or what the topic I guess should be, is that these people can interpret this however they want. If they're an apologist, that's going to affect the way they read it. So
it certainly can.
So, for example, Peter Flint, great guy, very passionate, a Christian, who is a great scholar too. I'm not saying anything bad about him as a person. However, I've noticed, I've used to watch his videos when I was a Christian. I used to be like, wow, this guy's, he's showing me that all these scrolls, these ancient scrolls, line up better with the Christian Bible than they do with the Jewish Bible.
We do have a clip that you could show about this.
We'll show it right now.
Let's do it.
Well, there's a very interesting verse in Psalm 22 in the King James. Dogs have surrounded me, a pack of evil ones close in on me, they have pierced my hands and my feet. Now you know this verse, and you would say this affirms for me crucifixion. Well, did you know that in fact, if you took this verse and spoke to a rabbi or even a Bible scholar, they would say, not so fast, because if you turn to the very Hebrew Bible that you use, your own Hebrew Bible, the Biblia Hebraica, you would be quite shocked, as I was, to discover it doesn't say that. The Hebrew Bible used by all churches today says, dogs surround me, a pack of evil ones close in on me, like a lion on my hands and feet. Now, some would say, you see, the church has messed with the text. They wanted to put Jesus in that text. They ignored the Hebrew, and they have pierced my hands and feet. That is a great challenge. But my friends, I've got good news for you. This passage is preserved in one of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I know what I'm talking about because I am the editor of the scroll. And there it is. There it is. The Nachal Cheva Psalm Scroll. And it contains this passage. And there it is. In the Hebrew. My dear friends, what does it say in the oldest copy of Psalm 122 in the world? Dogs have surrounded me. A band of evil ones has encircled me. They have pierced my hands and feet. Isn't that amazing? There you have.
I've dealt a little bit with this recently. I got into a back and forth with S.J. Thomason about this text, and I'm pulling my hair out at how she seems incapable of understanding what's going on here, but properly. But let's look at something like the NIV. So it's a famous passage. Jesus quoted the first verse of Psalm 22 on the cross. There's allusions to the imagery in Psalm 22 in the crucifixion scene. It's an important psalm in the crucifixion motif. Overzealous Christian apologists and defenders, and for a long time, have kind of pointed to this psalm as something of a miracle of fulfilled prophecy because of all the connections between Jesus and between the torture that the psalmist is enduring here. If you go down, I'll start reading at verse 14. I am poured out like water. All my bones are out of joint. And I'm reading here from the ludicrous New International Version translation of this. My heart is turned to wax. It has melted away within me. My strength has dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth. You lay me in the dust of death, Dogs have surrounded me. A band of evil men has encircled me. They have pierced my hands and my feet. I can count my bones. People stare and gloat over me, and on and on. But that phrase in particular there in verse 16, they have pierced my hands and my feet, sounds an awful lot like a description of crucifixion,
Right.
of the nails piercing the hands and the feet. And that translation is derived from the Septuagint.
Septuagint, the Greek, because that's not in the Masoretic text, right?
Correct. And
what does it say in the Masoretic text, just for anyone to know?
The Masoretic text actually reads, dogs surround me, a band of evil ones encircle me like a lion, my hands and my feet.
Wow, that's a whole different meaning now.
It's a whole different thing, and it's frustrating because on the face of it, it doesn't make a lot of sense.
Okay.
Like a lion, my hands and my feet. Well, welcome to Hebrew poetry, because
exactly how nothing.
Lots of it's like that.
Yeah, you can't translate text perfectly to English, and it makes sense.
And I think I mentioned on that stream actually with S.J. Thomason that I was on. I mentioned at one point, and Dr. Josh Bowen was on the stream with me, and he validated this as well. It's really frustrating how often within Hebrew poetry you will encounter sentences that simply don't have verbs, and it's a really, really difficult text.
Right.
So what has happened here? Well, first of all, I mean, we saw this clip from Professor Peter Flint talking about this text from the Dead Sea Scrolls,
right,
that preserves this reading. They pierced my hands and my feet.
And basically his argument, Peter Flint's argument, is that the Masoretic text has it wrong.
Yes.
The Septuagint actually had it right, because the Dead Sea Scrolls confirms this.
Yes.
Now let's get into why he got to that conclusion.
So let's start with the fragment in question. This is it. Okay, this is from the Nachal Hever Psalm Scroll. And it's a fairly, it's a little later. It didn't actually come from Qumran. It came from another site. And it dates to probably the end of the 1st century, maybe the beginning of the 2nd century CE. And like, you can see from this picture, right, how faded a lot of the letters are. I hate this program because
it's so faded that you almost don't even know if you can even translate it.
Yeah, I mean, I can recognize lots of those letters quite clearly.
See
certainly. Can you see my cursor?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so like all this stuff here, like on right sort of the right side, is really legible. The disputed text, the problematic text, occurs here.
Well, there's a big hole in it, first of all.
So you got, well, yeah. here you got Hakofu. Here it is. You've got Kof here.
It looks like a lion to me.
It's not, though.
Okay. That's what I'm just saying, that that's how hard it is to decipher.
It is very, or sorry, no, that's wrong. It's here. This is it.
That's the Kof?
This is the Kof. And this is the Aleph. You can probably see the Aleph a little bit more clearly.
Yeah, now that you mentioned it, I could see it now.
This is the Resh.
I definitely see the Resh. That's an easy letter. That's a letter R. Yeah, that's.
But this is either a Vav or a Yod. Now
let me ask you this real quick: Is a Yod in ancient Hebrew different than a Yod in modern Hebrew?
It depends on the manuscript you're looking at.
Okay, all right.
Okay, and this is one of the problems. You will very frequently see Hebrew manuscripts in antiquity where Vavs and Yods look almost identical to one another.
Yes.
That's not this particular manuscript. They are distinguished. So, and I will actually say that I think Professor Flint's reading, even though this is a nasty bit of work here.
Wow, yeah.
I've seen better pictures of this fragment, and I will say that I would agree with him that this is probably, I'm not going to say it's certainly a Vav, but I would say if I had to
It
pick
looks like a
between
Vav to me.
Yod and Vav, it's probably a Vav, which would, and that actually doesn't mean anything.
Right.
Kaf, Aleph, Resh, Vav is not a word. It's not, which is why we tend to think this is a scribal error. This is a mistake that a scribe has made. And I'm going to show you another fragment here. I pulled it up. Here it is. So this is the other fragment from the Dead Sea Scrolls.
A lot more legible.
It is.
I can see a perfect stomach. I can see a perfect lot. You can see it. The shin. All that.
Yeah. Good stuff.
Perfect. Yeah.
Very good. So the verse 16 in the English, verse 17 in the Hebrew, the like a lion, my hands and my feet, is down here on the bottom.
Wow, it's a scribble. Okay, so
and the word itself.
Before you say anything, real quick, I just want to let people know, what is the word for lion, and how do you get from lion to pierce? What's those words? So
the word for lion in Hebrew is ari, and it's prefixed with a preposition, which is the letter kaf, ke'ari, kaf, aleph, resh, yod, like a lion. Now, the confusion is that there's a form, there's a verb in Hebrew, kara, which is kaf, resh, hey. This is the verbal root,
right?
And it means to dig, like digging a grave or digging a pit.
Right. So that could be, someone can take that and say, that sounds like pierce to me, but it looks like it could be the word lion.
Yeah.
If it's not legible,
so
take the word lion and turn it into pierce.
Like I can show you here essentially what has happened.
Right. So
we could probably
real quick, just to say, for an English example of this would be word ship, for example, can be translated in two different ways. Let's say 2,000 years from now, some alien technology, some alien race comes and looks at somebody might decipher the word ship differently. This is kind of not exactly the same because they are two different words. But the reason why I use that example is when it's so blurry like this, you can take a word that means lion and change it to a word that looks like the word you're looking for. That makes sense.
Here is the verb that means to dig.
Right.
Keru. Okay. And here's the important difference. This means they dug.
Mm-hmm.
So this is what's in the Nachal Hever Psalm scroll. Now,
wow,
that
looks more like a lion than they dug, obviously, because the aleph changes the whole word completely, right?
It does. So, but this doesn't mean anything.
Okay. So now, real quick, just to jump in real quick, you said that people don't really know if it's a vav or a yod, right?
Yeah.
Now, if it's a yod, it's like a lion, and that's case closed. We're done. But because it might be a vav, we don't know what it is. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it means to dig either.
No.
So that's
now the way that Peter Flint and the way that people who handle this particular scroll arrive at this as they dug is they're suggesting that this aleph here is a vowel letter. In lots of Second Temple, in lots of early Jewish manuscripts, there was no vowel pointing. Okay, it was just consonants. But in a number of places, they started to employ vocalic letters like vav, yod, and aleph.
Yeah.
As vowels.
Because they don't have vowels. Because essentially there's no vowel.
Exactly.
So you use letter vav for letter O. Just so basic one. You lose a letter.
So
yeah. Okay.
You got it. So the argument is that this here, keru, with the aleph, is actually just a lengthened form of this verb that the scribe has supplied this letter. Now, if you'll bear with me,
yes, go ahead.
There's several points that I will make here to show that this absolutely cannot be the case. But before I get to that, I just wanted to talk a little bit about this fragment here. The reading that we're talking about occurs at the very bottom. Here is the hey, the kof. Here's the vav, the pei. So this is the previous word. Peter Flint has actually read keru here somewhere.
Are you kidding?
Which I'm not. I'm not. It's actually
he decided that's what it means.
I will actually pull it up for you.
Okay, so just tell everybody what are we looking at right now? What exactly?
So we're looking at Peter Flint's transcription. So this is what he is suggesting is on the bottom line 25, and you see the bottom margin here. He's suggesting this is what's on the bottom line of this fragment. So he's reading that from these letters here.
Well, look at those letters, by the way.
So right on the bottom.
So hard to see that.
It's crazy. So, and I'm going to suggest that, yeah, it's nonsense that you can even clearly see the kof or the resh to say nothing of whether this is a vav or a yod. I'm actually kind of while we're here, I'm interested to see what he says in his note. Here's his note. Okay. He says, the central part of the top of kaf has flaked off, prior to which it had the same width and slant as that in Hokam 10 in 3 verse 18. The manuscript may well have had the grammatically correct reading, keru, with a handful of Masoretic manuscripts and the Septuagint. The mater lectionis, which is the vowel letter, was inserted in keru by 5-6 Hever Psalms, and that's the tradition Hever Psalm.
Wow for yod. Wow.
Ke'ari. So I'm going to suggest to you that this is a nonsense explanation.
Yeah.
And here is why. Okay. I've got a few points to run through here. Okay. First and foremost, the word like a lion, ke'ari, in the Septuagint was translated with a word that means to dig in the Greek. It does not in any context in the entirety of Greek literature ever mean pierced, like to stab, right?
Yes.
Same with the Hebrew.
And that's what every Christian Bible right now has in their text, is they pierced.
Correct. So this is,
but go ahead.
It's never used as pierced, not once. Second, the word appearing in the Nachal Hever Psalm scroll is kof aleph resh vav. If this is supposed to be a verb, the verbal root ka'ar does not mean anything that anyone recognizes in the entirety of Hebrew literature and is thus not translatable. Third, it is likely that the Greek translator of the Septuagint encountered a reading like this, something that looked like what we see in the Nachal Hever Psalm scroll. He was confused by it because this is a word that doesn't mean anything, and decided to render it with horaksan, which means to dig. They dug, thinking that maybe this was a lengthened form of keru, the Hebrew verb, which means to dig. As in Greek, in Hebrew, this word always and only means to dig. It never, in any context that we know of, means to pierce. Not once. So at best, it means they dug my hands and feet, which, I don't know, means someone thought they looked really cool.
Yeah.
So,
but you know,
okay.
What? And it shows you how something like a lion can get malleable and be changed into pierce. It just goes, all it takes is you to change the word from lion to dig, because they look the same, almost the same. And then you take the word dig and reinterpret it to pierce. So it just shows you how
exactly
you can literally change the text. And when you translate a text from ancient Hebrew to modern English, you can make it say whatever you want. If you really try, if you really do the work and you can do whatever you want with it.
It can happen. So here's the money shot, though. I think this is the money shot. So the word in the Nachal Hever Psalm scroll, Kof, Aleph, Resh, Vav, cannot be construed as a lengthened form of the Hebrew verb keru. And here's why. This is what we call, within studying the Hebrew manuscripts, this is what we call orthography. Orthography is the use of vowel letters or the absence of vowel letters. And orthography tends to be fairly consistent. What I mean by that is a manuscript that has a long orthography where they inserted lots of vowel letters, they'll do it throughout the whole manuscript. Other manuscripts that do not use any orthography at all, they do it throughout the whole manuscript. It's kind of a consistent thing. And here's the really important part. It's essentially based independently on each manuscript. So from one manuscript to the next manuscript, you're going to have different systems of orthography. And it's very important when you're reading an individual manuscript that you're paying attention to the specific orthographic system that is being used in that manuscript. So here's the kicker. The word in the Nachal Hever Psalm scroll, Kof, Aleph, Resh, Vav, cannot be construed as the lengthened form of keru because the orthography or the spelling in the Nachal Hever Psalm scroll is extremely defective. It's really, really, really short. Even more so than the Masoretic text. So what that means is throughout the entirety of the scroll, there are no vowel letters. Not anywhere.
So that would make no sense to randomly in this one passage, the one that happens to be the one that's the blurriest, they just randomly put a vowel there.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna continue here and finish up.
Go ahead.
So this means that vowel letters are never employed in this particular manuscript. It is virtually certain that the scribe of the Nachal Hever Psalm scroll misconstrued the yod in Ka'ari, which means like a lion, for a vav. This is something that happens with great frequency at the time because we don't know what the manuscript looks like that he's reading from, but it's very likely that he was reading from a manuscript where the difference between a vav and a yod was so slight that you just couldn't tell. So what happened? He wrote this word, Kof, Aleph, Resh, Vav, which does not mean anything that we know of. The discovery of the Nachal Hever Psalm scroll has contributed to our understanding of the textual history of this passage, and it has confirmed without a shadow of a doubt that this reading in the Septuagint, Horaksan, he dug my hands and feet, that has been translated by numerous English translations as he pierced my hands and my feet, is the result of an accident. An accidental scribal error has produced this whole mess.
Wow, that is
so there we go.
That is so, you just explained it perfectly. That you're right, that is the kicker. If I didn't know that, you can almost lean towards Peter Flint, but now that you mentioned they never use vowels in that entire manuscript, why would it be that one sentence, the one that's the blurriest, happens to have vowels now? So you're right. It virtually doesn't make any sense.
And this is the really key point when you hear apologists talk about this manuscript. This is the key point that they never get.
Yeah,
they say, "Oh, it's Keru," and look at all these other manuscripts from the Dead Sea Scrolls,
right,
that use vowel letters.
So the different manuscript could be a different scribe. So
exactly,
that's
and
like
a different.
Yeah, that's like saying, "Oh,
different spelling systems.
This book has this in it, so that means this book Harry has the same book too." Like, no, you can't do that. Yeah. And another kicker too. I mean, that was the kicker. You're definitely right. But another one that people should realize is when it comes to the Masoretic text, these Jews don't mess around. They write down exactly what it says, and it gets passed down like that, like we said in the beginning of the show, when I asked you the question, was what we have today pretty much exactly what was written down before? And you even granted, most likely yes, maybe a couple of different changes, but mostly yes, especially when it comes to the Masoretic text. They did not mess around with this at all. So you have to lean, even if it's questionable, you have to render this as we have to go with the Masoretic text, right? I mean, that's my opinion.
Yes, yes. There's a there is a rule within textual criticism. It's that we employ when approaching the text. It's not a hard and fast rule, but it's a pretty good one for determining what the quote unquote original text or the earliest text was, and that is, the more difficult the text, the more likely it is to be original. And the reason for that is because scribal emendation occurs when scribes are frustrated by things or confused by things. So if there's a reading that is easy and makes abundant sense, and another one which looks really odd, text critics will tend to sort of look at a situation like that and say, you know what, this difficult reading, this weird text, there's other things that we go, there's other factors that we weigh into consideration, but this is a pretty big one, because more often than not, this is how scribal change occurs.
Right.
They're fixing what they see as mistakes in the text. So when you encounter a text that's really tough and weird and looks like it might be messed up, chances are probably decent that this is that you're dealing with something that's earlier on in the textual tradition.
It's funny that it just happens to be one of the two texts that differ from Christian to Jewish text, which is makes me more fascinating.
Yeah, that's a big one. And of course, the reason, this explains why Peter wrote the edition he did. He's really invested in this. So much so, I think it got the better of him. He was so excited when he discovered that reading in the Nachal Hever Psalm scroll, the Kof Aleph Resh Vav. He was so excited by that
he went with his emotion. And speaking of emotions getting the best out of scholars, Josh McDowell.
Oh boy,
this is a prime example of somebody jumping the gun way too fast. So this guy, you want to tell the story about the first century, what was it, John manuscript?
First century Mark.
Yeah,
sure. So, and for any viewers who are interested, I've made a documentary about Josh McDowell.
It's amazing. I watched the entire thing. It was phenomenal. Thoroughly done.
I appreciate it. So, the documentary basically tells the story of Josh McDowell and his involvement with first century Mark, but also tracks how his own personal story and his own testimony has developed and changed over time. So back in 2012, it was making the rounds among academics, this video presentation that McDowell had given at a church. And the reason it caused such a stir was because he was bragging in this video about extracting ancient New Testament manuscripts from an Egyptian funerary mask. And this is a practice called dismounting. These funerary masks were made of bits of papyrus, discarded papyrus that they molded into like a paper mache. Right. They turn it into a mask and then they paint it, right? So it's a practice that has been discarded by scholars. One of the reasons, of course, because
disrespect.
It's super disrespectful, to take one culture's treasures.
Screw this person being buried. I'm just going to take what I need from them. Like,
exactly, wow. And destroying them.
Talk about being really whatever, man. Like,
The other reason this has been discarded by almost everybody is the payoff is extremely meager. Most of the vast majority of the fragments that were used in making these masks were scraps of documents and letters, like lists, letters, titles, deeds of sale, these sorts of things, what we call documentary text, the day-to-day writings. This is a documentary text, it's my notes for a project I'm working on, that sort of thing, right? So there's certainly not enough payoff to completely destroy a mummy mask if all you're going to get out of there is somebody's grocery list and their tax return.
That's crazy. So what happened ended up happening. Oh, go ahead.
So what happened was McDowell bragged about how they're pulling all these amazingly valuable, interesting, ancient fragments from the New Testament and from bits of other classical Greek literature from these mummy masks. And he's super callous in his presentation of it. At one point he says, scholars die when we do this, but we own them, so we can do it.
Scholars die when they hear it, but we own them, so you can do it. You take these manuscripts, we soak them in water. We put it down.
At another point, he talks about how because
wasn't he washing the manuscripts in a sink with soap?
Yes. So the pictures that he took actually came from an event that took place at Baylor University that same year, where a scholar by the name of Scott Carroll, who was the first curator of the collection of artifacts at the Museum of the Bible, actually took one of these mummy masks and plunged it into the sink at Baylor University with warm water and soap, and pulled it apart. And I've been in conversation with somebody who was actually at the event that this took place. And what happened was, like I said, because there's the types of manuscripts, the types of papyrus that are inside of these mummy masks are not all that exciting. So Carroll brought with him actual literary Greek fragments, some of which came from the Oxyrhynchus collection belonging to the Egypt Exploration Society at the University of Oxford. He brought them with him, and he seeded the mask with them. So he took the mask and put it in the water, and then took these, you're going to die when you hear this, took these priceless Greek manuscript fragments that were already part of a museum collection, and putting them in the water with the mask, and then pulling it all out and going, oh, look, Sappho.
What?
Or, oh, look, it's the Book of Romans.
They planted them there? That's so crazy. And so then he claims that this was the oldest manuscript we've ever found, which, by the way, right now I think we're in the 120s, or is it later than that? Right now,
you're talking about the John Rylands papyrus. Evangelical apologists like to claim it dates as early as 125. I don't think there's any credible scholar that'll date it quite that early. So we're talking most of the people, late second century. Right. Mid to late second century, 150 to 200 is right. The safest bet. So that is the oldest New Testament manuscript that we have.
Right. And for him to say this is from the first century would be mind-blowing for everybody. And he just makes this claim like it's a fact. And
yes. They in this presentation, he says, this is how we discovered Mark from the first century. So he's doing a couple things here. Wow. First of all, he's inserting himself into the discovery narrative of this fragment. First
he really
century
had nothing
Mark.
to do with it. He was just there.
He had nothing to do with it at all. It was not extracted from a mummy mask. The first century Mark fragment was a fragment that one of the editors for the the Oxyrhynchus collection at the University of Oxford. His name is Dirk Obink, and he was working with the Museum of the Bible. This was a fragment, along with a series of other fragments, that he offered for sale to the Museum of the Bible, and claimed that, and he was a brilliant papyrologist and a very good paleographer. Paleography is the study of ancient writings and the way in which we date manuscripts. So he was a very good paleographer, and he said that he thought this was from the 1st century. It's a little fragment from the Gospel of Mark.
Little fragment. That's
very little.
Very little.
Like this big.
Yeah.
3 lines. 3 lines of text. And so, I mean, it's most likely from the Gospel of Mark, but you know, it's such a small fragment, we can't even be all that certain of that.
That's great.
So it's this tiny little fragment. He offered it for sale along with a bunch of others to the Museum of the Bible, claiming this was a fragment from the 1st century. And this news kind of got out at a famous debate between Daniel Wallace from Dallas Seminary and Bart Ehrman from University of
I watched that
North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Did you watch this debate, right?
I did. Good debate.
Yeah. So it was a very good debate. And in his opening statement, Wallace mentions this fragment.
Right.
You know, we now have a copy of Mark from the 1st century.
And he says, this is what he says, quote, the person that is saying this is putting his whole entire career on the line for this. So I believe him. Sure enough.
Yes.
Womp, 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 the guy was wrong.
Exactly. Because in retrospect, what we have learned, this happened in 2012. All of this happened in 2012. And the expectation was that this fragment would be published the following year in 2013, and it was delayed and delayed. 2014, 2015.
That delay really helped McDowell out, because that whole time people were like, "Oh my God, we have a 1st century manuscript."
And McDowell's milking this, right? He's going around claiming to everybody, we now have a 1st century copy of Mark. And, you know, kind of inserts himself into the story there as a, hello, I was there when we found this.
He discovered it, basically.
Yeah. So, but the publication delays for years and years. Finally, it appeared in 2018 in the latest volume of publications from the Egypt Exploration Society of the Oxyrhynchus collection. So what happened here was this was actually a fragment that belonged to the Oxyrhynchus collection.
That's great.
Dirk
Obink. What is the dating for this?
It is from the 3rd century.
Go ahead.
So it's a Mark fragment from the 3rd century, but the story itself is so much deeper than that, because Dirk Obink was taking fragments from the Oxyrhynchus collection, which belongs to the Egypt Exploration Society.
Did he get in trouble?
Oh yeah.
Oh
yeah. He's facing charges for this.
That's so
for theft and fraud and all this stuff, because he was trying to sell these things.
And this is the guy that wrote the famous More Than a Carpenter, not the guy who did this, but the guy.
So Obink is in trouble. McDowell was just.
I'm not talking about. But
so
Obink's in trouble. McDowell was the one who wrote More Than a Carpenter, which is like a famous book that every Christian reads.
And evidence of the verdict.
And he's the one dealing with this stuff and making it like this. Just when I hear this stuff, and the reason why I'm saying this is not the first time you hear stories like this. You hear these stories happen all the time. I'll give you another example real quick. When the NASB got created, the New American Standard Bible, the establishment Christians who sell the Bible, what do you call it? I don't even know what the name of the Bible sales, like Bible Association or whatever. For some reason, people in this high up,
American Bible Society.
American Bible Association, thank you. This was bad. We need to sell our King James Bibles and keep people. So what happened was, there was a man who they said repented. This was in a radio broadcast, a Christian TV show or Christian radio show, where they had this guy come on and repented, and he's like, I'm the co-creator of the New American Standard Bible, and I'm repenting right now for making this Bible, because this Bible is not pure and perfect. This is not the holy word of God. So all the King James heads are like, wow, look at this. This is crazy. And this is still to this day, this is pushed in churches. Turns out that the person who said this had nothing to do absolutely zero zilch to do with the creation of the New American Standard Bible. He just was some random guy that went on a went on a radio show and just lied. Cold
Wow.
lie, cold lie.
Yeah.
So this is the stuff I'm hearing as I'm deconverting. And I'm like, this is just too much of this trickery going on. You know what I'm saying?
And this is what I don't get, right? Like, and I more than anything, and I'm not a practicing Christian. I'm a cultural Christian at this point. But even when I was still a practicing Christian, I hated liars.
Yeah, I couldn't.
And I started getting on this with apologists and apologetics. At the last the last place that I taught was an evangelical Christian university close by here. And when I was doing my PhD, when I was working on my PhD, I was also working as a teaching assistant for an apologetics professor at this university. And he had these he taught these two courses. It was like an introduction to Christian worldview course, and then which was a first year course, and then a fourth year course about developing a Christian worldview or something like that. So, and every single freshman at the university and every single senior had to take these courses. So he had these massive classes. Like his freshman class, there was like 450 students usually, right? So, which is why he needed an assistant so badly. But it was an amazing time for me, because this is the sort of thing that we would deal with. He's he's a theologian and he's an apologist, and he used to tell me, one of the things that he felt a personal burden to teach the courses in a certain way, because he was convinced, in his words, that everyone in our biblical studies department, in the religious studies department, had sold out to the Enlightenment. And what that means essentially is
liberal.
that
they're all liberals, right?
Bunch of dirty liberals. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
So, his courses were all about, finding the narrative kernel within the biblical story. That's the true story. And, it was an interesting time. He actually, I remember for his senior class, he would, because it was an exploration of worldview, we would, there were focuses like every week on different disciplines, like biology and then politics and history. And, the goal of the class was to investigate ways in which we explore and approach these disciplines from a Christian worldview, right?
Yeah.
And so students had things that they had to read and they had to write responses and reflections on. I got to read them all, lucky me, and grade them. And I was so frustrated by I was frustrated by a few of them, but the one that really got me was when it came to biology. He pulled an article that was written by Stephen R. Meyer. I don't know if you're familiar with that name, but this is a guy who was he's a big deal in evangelical circles still, but he's affiliated with the Discovery Institute. He was right in there with the working on strategies on the Kitzmüller versus Dover trial about teaching evolution and creation in schools in the United States, right? So he's basically assigning this quasi-creationist article to these students to read as reflective of a Christian worldview in biology, right? It was disgusting. I was so bothered by this. And the documentary by Nova, which is called, I believe it's called Evolution on Trial. If you haven't seen it, you have to go watch it. It's free. If you live in Buffalo, so you should be able to get it for free on the PBS site.
Nice.
But it's all about the trial from I guess was that 2005, 2006.
And this was the notorious called the trial of, they did a name for it. It was like the trial of something. What was it called again?
Well, I don't remember what they called it, but it was basically the trial determining whether or not they could teach intelligent design.
There you go. Yeah.
Schools,
that's what it was called.
Right?
Creationism on trial.
Or something like that. So
this was a big deal. This was a big turning point for academia, because no longer
it really was.
Yeah, no longer can you just say we have our a different way of looking at the world based on our evidence. But now they're saying, listen, you don't have any evidence. This is all credible science. This is all mythical science. This is not real science. And they decided that it's over.
Yeah. So this documentary had come out shortly before, this happened in this class. So what I did, we had I actually included a link to the documentary on our on one of the main course pages, and told students, if you're going to read this article, you absolutely also need to watch this documentary, because
that's case law.
Yeah.
Case law.
He got pretty upset. I got a note from him the next day. He's like, "What are you doing?
Wow.
Why did you put this link up there?" And I just told him, I said, "Look, you're all about ensuring that everybody gets an equal playing field here. Then, people need to
you did the right thing.
Oh, I thought so too.
Yeah.
But this is apologetics, and it's most of it's based on lies, and based on creatively structuring historical arguments and evidence in such a way that they make your case. And it's big business too, right? Let's not kid ourselves.
Yeah.
I mean, some of these guys like Lee Strobel and J. Warner Wallace have become millionaires,
crushing it off these books and movies, crushing it,
writing these best-selling books that sell like hotcakes.
Yeah.
I know McDowell, in my research, I know McDowell for many, many, many years. Actually, all the proceeds from the sales of his books went right back into the ministry. So at least he wasn't, pocketing it all.
Do you know how wealthy you could get if someone like you, like a PhD in biblical studies and theology, if someone like you decided that, you know what, I'm just going to pretend I'm a Christian, and then becoming, I saw the light, I had a vision, dude, you would have all attention on you. You'd have a book deal, you'd have a movie deal, you'd have everything thrown your way immediately.
Yeah.
You're
probably right.
Yeah.
So
you'd be like, oh my God, this atheist, PhD scholar, he saw the light. Look at this, everybody.
It raises questions, though, about how often, why.
Right.
Why does this, how often has this happened?
Exactly.
It hasn't really. And then why? What was I going to say? What would really, really impress me, and it's something that I've never seen before, is if a biblical scholar, like a bona fide secular or a Jewish or an atheist biblical scholar, went through his entire studies all the way up to the PhD level, and at that point said, you know what, this is really convincing, I think I need to become a Christian. That would be compelling.
It would be.
But I have never heard of such a thing.
No, it's always the other way around. It's always like, I got into this because I really was a Christian and I really wanted to learn. And then I started learning about, textual criticism and all this stuff. And I kind of deconverted. Now I'm just a cultural critic, like yourself.
And most of my, most of my colleagues are still believers, right? Excuse me, but they have, for the most part, you develop strategies as a scholar and as a Christian on how to come to grips with being a responsible scholar,
yeah,
and also maintaining your faith. And for me, it just became about I just had to separate it. I just had to say, when I'm doing history, that's what I'm doing.
right.
I'm I'm reading the texts. I'm I'm studying the secondary literature. I'm trying to come to the best naturalistic explanation for the most plausible uh, reason for the events. Right. This is what I'm doing. And then I would go to church, and I would read the text on, I guess, a different level of sorts, right?
Yes.
But for some people can do that their entire lives.
Yeah.
But some of us, and I'm not alone. I've got lots of friends who have gone through this same situation
Yeah.
with me. Over time, um, your historical investigations, your commitment um, to being responsible, I would say, with the text and with the discipline, comes to just override
Isn't that
and
ironic?
take over everything else.
Isn't that
It
ironic?
really is.
It's ironic that doing the right thing will take you from like pushing a Christian religious narrative into the opposite. Very ironic.
Yeah. Well, this is the thing that I find quite interesting. When it comes to my documentary about McDowell, one of the things that I was really keen on exploring was how much embellishment and how much fabrication he has committed
Yeah.
in just in telling his own story,
Yeah.
giving his testimony. And you understand this when within the Christian community, certain Christian communities, certainly the one that I was part of, there was a good deal of emphasis that was set on your personal testimony,
Yeah.
and the
Yes.
importance of it. I actually went to a discipleship school right after high school, where we worked on it. Like, we would sit in classes and we would give our testimony. We get feedback on it, and
Yeah.
people would tell us, well, I like this, I didn't like this, you should probably do this. Right? You're crafting a narrative. This is
Yes.
what McDowell is doing.
Yes. You mythicize your own self. I did it myself. I know other
Totally.
Christians. I know other Christians. I'm not going to say his name, but he would tell everybody that he got in this bad car accident and it got him addicted to opiates. And he didn't tell anybody that he was doing opiates before the car accident. He didn't, and I knew this because I grew up with him. And then he's telling them all that the accident got him on opiates, and that he prayed to Jesus, and then he stopped doing opiates. He didn't tell people that he went on a maintenance drug to get off of it.
Yeah.
It's like, wow, how can you? But I did the same thing though. I did the same thing.
We all did. I think we all did. There's pressure there, right?
You mythicize your testimony because you want other people to be like, wow, this is really true. It's just part of what it is, being in that world.
It is. So with McDowell, this is it's a very important part of his whole apologetic, is his own personal testimony. So he's telling it over and over again. He's written it. He's included it in several of his books. So I spent the time looking and tracking and seeing how it's changed and how it's developed, and actually was able to show places where he has just outright lied.
Yeah.
About his past. And I'm not even talking about simple exaggerations. I'm talking about
cold lies,
just bald-faced lies.
Yeah. I'm gonna put a link in the description to watch that documentary. That's on your channel. So anyone watching, go to that and check that out.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Well, I'll give you an example. He talks about in one of the later versions of his testimony, he talks about how it's all constructed on this grand pursuit of truth.
Yes.
That takes him on this cross-continental journey. He travels all over the world looking for truth. And his search for truth eventually ended up convincing him of the veracity of Christianity.
Right.
And one of the things in one of his later retellings of this story, he says that he went and studied, and this all apparently happened when he was 19 or 20 years old, as a freshman at a community college in Battle Creek, Michigan. So as a 20-year-old college freshman, he says that he studied at the University of Michigan and the Harvard University libraries. So that's just false.
Yeah.
I've been to the Harvard libraries. And furthermore, because of this, I ended up getting in contact with the archivists at Harvard to ask some questions, and I was hoping maybe I could find some actual documentation. Unfortunately, all their documents were lost in a fire before 1960. Everything from before 1962, I think, is gone. So, but they were able to confirm. What's that?
And he was there before that, according to him.
According to him, he would have been there in 1959, 1960, thereabouts, right? So, but not just anybody can walk off the street and into the libraries at Harvard. You just can't do it. There's there's security, doors. You have to show your student ID just to get into the library.
Right.
I, could go and apply for special permission to come and study at Harvard.
Right.
But, in the application, I would have to include, my own credentials. I would have to tell them what I'm working on, why I want to come to Harvard to work in their libraries. Depending on who you are, you may actually have to get a sponsor from the university, like a faculty member, to say, yeah, this person's okay. He's legitimate. He can come in here. There is just no way. There's no way a 20-year-old college undergraduate just went to Harvard to study in the libraries there. It didn't.
And then his story was really strange too. He just all of a sudden he's talking with these people that are saying Christianity is the truth, and he wanted to prove them wrong.
Yeah.
You're in a Harvard library with a bunch of Christians that are there. Where did that come from?
Well,
that story sounds very
there's
strange.
sort of different parts of the same story, but it is a strange story like that. I think that's the thing that kind of caught me on this right at the outset. I sort of went, when I first heard this stuff about him traveling all over the world and looking at ancient manuscripts as a 19 or a 20-year-old, I kind of went, yeah, I remember being 20.
Yeah. And then back then it was really expensive to travel on plane back then.
Oh, geez, yeah. It
wouldn't be like it is today.
Prohibitively expensive. And I actually learned through this too. Like I said, this happened sometime around 1959 or 1960. Commercial air travel in jet planes is something that had only just started in, I believe it's 1959.
Wow.
So this was brand new. And the people who flew on jet planes,
you were rich. You were a millionaire, basically.
Movie stars, wealthy businessmen, not
just some kid in college.
So So anyways, it's an interesting it's an interesting study.
Yeah.
And I actually picked this up. One of my buddies, when he read the script before the film came out, he actually commented on this, and I made some changes and incorporated it into the ending there. He's like, one of the things that is really remarkable about this is how we can actually track the McDowell myth, essentially, that occurs over just a very, very short period of time. Right away, one is left to think about how much apologists love to talk about how difficult it would have been for the evangelists, for the gospel writers, to have invented stories about Jesus, because within a 30, 40, 50-year period, somebody would have noticed. Somebody would have called him on it. Somebody would have said, no, that did not happen. And yet, here we are in the 21st century, in a media-saturated culture, in a hyper-literate culture, and McDowell has been getting away with it for his entire adult life. And even after he's been called out on it through things like my documentary, there was a book written at one time I was unable to find that I know at least touched on some of the same stuff that I'm doing. Evangelical apologists love to talk about how impossible it would be to do this, to invent stories about Jesus, because somebody would have noticed, somebody would have called them on it. And here McDowell has been doing it for his entire adult life. And even after the documentary, I don't expect anything to change.
No, me either. It's too much. Because too much on the line. His whole life's on the line. You know what I mean?
And yes. And I'm fairly sure, I'm pretty confident that if called out on it from within the community, they'll get together and they'll rationalize it. In some way or form, because this is kind of what happens within the bubble, right?
I think it was actually McDowell himself that said the quote, Jesus could only be three things. A liar.
No, it was C.S. Lewis. But
C.S. Lewis?
Yeah,
okay. But it's like then but I used to hear that, even as a Christian, I used to hear that and be like, can't there be a fourth that someone else wrote all this?
Yeah.
Like, it's that simple. Like, there's only three options. What are you talking about? But yeah, man, you've been here for a while, man. I'm sure
that's true.
Yeah. So
it is dinner time.
Listen, man, this was amazing. This was a gold. I can't wait to, I'm glad I finally met you. And
yeah, me too.
Thanks for coming on. And everybody, check out his channel. It's just look up his name. It's pop right up. Kip Davis. Great channel, great work, and an expert in the field. So it's a good tool to have. And see you guys later.